On the night of November 8, 1939, a beer hall in Munich was packed shoulder to shoulder. Brown uniforms, brass music, the smell of spilled lager and cigarette smoke. At the front of the room stood Adolf Hitler, the most heavily guarded man in Europe, speaking beneath a thick stone pillar. He did not know that the pillar was hollow. He did not know that inside it a clock was ticking. And he did not know that the man who put it there was, at that very moment, standing at the Swiss border in the dark, his pockets full of evidence. At 9:20 that night, the pillar exploded. Hitler had walked out the door 13 minutes earlier. History remembers the generals who tried to kill Hitler in 1944, the aristocrats, the colonels, the briefcase under the table. But almost 5 years earlier, one man came closer than all of them. No title, no conspiracy, no army behind him. Just a carpenter, a chisel, and a conscience. His name was Georg Elser, and for half a century his own country would call him a liar. He was born in 1903 in a small Württemberg village, and he grew up in a town called Königsbrunn, tucked into the hills of southern Germany. He was not a soldier. He was not a politician. He was a craftsman, quiet, stubborn, exact. He trained as a cabinet maker, and he was good with his hands in a way that few people are. He could look at a piece of wood and see the finished thing inside it. People who knew Georg Elser described a man of few words, who kept to himself, played the zither in a local music club, and cared more about doing a job properly than about getting ahead. For 4 years in the 1920s, Elser worked in a clock factory on the shores of Lake Constance. It seemed an ordinary job, but it taught him something that would one day matter more than anyone could imagine: the patient, microscopic mechanics of time itself, springs, escapements, gears measured in fractions of a millimeter. He learned how to make a machine count the hours with perfect, silent precision. Years later, he would use exactly that knowledge to build a clock designed to kill. By the late 1930s, Elser had seen enough. He watched his wages shrink year after year, while the men at the top spoke of glory. He watched workers lose their freedoms, their unions, their voice. And above all, he watched Germany march, step by step, toward another war, a war he was certain would be a catastrophe. Elser did not need a newspaper to tell him what was coming. He simply looked at the world around him and reached a conclusion that millions of better educated, better connected Germans refused to reach. The regime would have to be stopped, and no one else was going to do it. In the autumn of 1938, as Europe held its breath over the Munich crisis, Georg Elser made a decision that almost no one else in Germany was willing to make. He would kill Hitler, not protest, not flee, not wait for the generals or the politicians or some imagined uprising. He would do it himself, alone, and he would do it where the dictator was most predictable. Every November, Hitler returned to one place to give one speech, the Bürgerbraukeller in Munich, where his failed coup of 1923 had begun. It was a ritual, and a ritual, Elser understood, is a vulnerability. He prepared the way a craftsman prepares, methodically, without illusions. In November of 1938, he traveled to Munich and attended the anniversary event himself, blending into the crowd, watching everything. And what he found astonished him. The most powerful man in Germany spoke, year after year, in a hall that was barely guarded. Directly behind the speaker's platform stood a heavy stone pillar that held up the gallery above. If a bomb were hidden inside that pillar, Elser realized, it would bring the entire ceiling down on Hitler's head. He had found his weapon. Now he had to build it. He took a job at an armaments factory, and another at a quarry, not for the wages, but for what those places contained: explosives, detonators, the raw materials of his plan. Quietly, over months, he gathered what he needed, a little at a time, drawing no attention. In a rented room, he built and tested his device with the same care he gave a piece of furniture. The heart of it was a timer, 2 clock movements that would run for 144 hours, 6 full days, before triggering the charge. The watchmaker's apprentice had become the bomb maker, and he intended to be far away when his clock ran out. In August 1939, Elser moved to Munich and began the most extraordinary part of his plan. Night after night, he would eat dinner in the Burgerbräukeller like any other customer. He would pay his bill at 10 o'clock, say good night, and then slip into a storeroom and hide. He waited in the dark until the staff locked up and went home, and then, alone in the silent beer hall, by the thin beam of a flashlight, he went to work on the pillar. The work was agonizing. The pillar was clad in wood, so first he spent 3 entire nights silently sawing through the paneling, and from that same wood, he fashioned a secret door that would close flush against the surface, invisible. Then came the stone. With a hammer and chisel and a hand drill, he chipped out the mortar and prized away the bricks, one by one. Every blow had to be muffled. Every speck of sawdust, every fragment of brick, had to be gathered into a cloth and carried out, so that not a single trace remained by morning. Some nights, when a tram rumbled past outside, he timed his hammer blows to its noise. He did this, in secret, in the dark, for roughly 35 nights. By early November, the cavity was finished, a hidden chamber carved into solid stone, sealed behind a door no one would ever notice. On the night of November 2nd, Georg Elser placed his bomb inside. He had built the timer into a wooden box and lined it with cork, so that the ticking could not be heard through the stone. He set the mechanism. 144 hours. He came back twice more, opening his secret door in the darkness, pressing his ear close, listening. The clock was running. Everything was ready. Now there was only the waiting. If you made it this far, you're one of us. Hit subscribe and like. We unbury history every week. Now, back to our story. November 8th, 1939. Hitler was scheduled to speak that evening, as he did every year, surrounded by the old fighters of his movement. Elser's bomb was set to detonate at 9:20 p.m., timed to the very heart of the speech. Everything depended on routine. But that night, the weather intervened. A thick fog settled over Munich, and Hitler's aircraft was grounded. To get back to Berlin, he would have to take the night train, which meant he had to begin his speech earlier than usual, and cut it short. Inside the packed Burgerbräukeller, Hitler spoke for barely an hour, where normally he might speak for 2. He finished, stepped down, and at around 7 minutes past 9, he and his entourage swept out of the hall to catch the train. The crowd was still buzzing, the band was still there, and buried in the pillar just behind where Hitler had stood, the clock kept counting down. 12 minutes, 10, 8. At 20 minutes past 9, the bomb went off. The explosion tore through the pillar and brought the gallery and part of the ceiling crashing down onto the exact spot where Hitler had been standing only 13 minutes before. The hall filled with dust and screaming. 8 people were killed and more than 60 injured, most of them ordinary party members, and a waitress who had been clearing tables. But the one man Georg Elser had built it all to kill was already gone, racing through the night toward Berlin. There is a cruel irony at the center of this story. At the very moment his bomb was killing the wrong people, Georg Elser was not celebrating, and he was not escaping. He had already been arrested. Hours earlier, near the Swiss border at Constance, guards had stopped a nervous man trying to slip across. In his pockets they found sketches of a detonator, components of a fuse, a badge of the outlawed Communist Party, and a postcard of the inside of the Burgerbräukeller. When news of the Munich explosion reached them, the pieces fit together. The carpenter, who had nearly changed history, was in a cell before the dust had even settled. The Gestapo could not accept what they were looking at. To them, it was impossible that a single working man, with no organization and no orders, could have built such a device and breached such security entirely on his own. They were certain of a conspiracy, a foreign hand, a hidden network. So they interrogated him for weeks, in Munich and then in Berlin, reportedly in the presence of Himmler himself. They beat him, they pressured him, and Georg Elser told them the truth over and over. He had acted alone. To prove it, he calmly rebuilt a model of his bomb in front of them. He gave up no accomplices, because there were none. But the regime had no use for the truth. The very next day, in a separate operation at the Dutch border town of Venlo, The SS kidnapped 2 British intelligence officers in a carefully laid trap. Now the propagandists had everything they needed. They simply stitched the 2 events together. The official story became that Georg Elser was not a lone idealist at all, but a puppet, a tool of the British Secret Service, and exiled enemies of the Reich, sent to murder the Führer. It was a complete fabrication, but it was a useful one. It turned an embarrassing security failure into proof of a foreign plot, and it gave the regime an excuse for a grand show trial somewhere down the road. That show trial never came. Instead, Elser was locked away as a special prisoner, kept alive and held in isolation, first in Sachsenhausen, then in Dachau, a man the regime wanted to keep on a shelf, to be used whenever it suited them. He was given slightly better conditions than other inmates, a fact that would later be twisted against his memory. For more than 5 years, he waited in the shadows of the camps, while the war he had tried to prevent consumed the continent exactly as he had feared. And then, in the final weeks of the war, when the outcome was no longer in doubt and the camps were within reach of the advancing Allies, the order came. On April 9, 1945, Georg Elser was taken aside at Dachau and shot. He was 42 years old. Liberation was less than a month away. The man who had tried to stop the war in 1939 did not live to see it end in 1945. He died as he had acted, alone. You might expect that after the war, Germany would have honored him at once. It did not. The lie outlived the liars. Because Elser had been kept as a privileged prisoner, rumors spread among survivors that the bombing had been a Nazi trick all along, a staged attack to make Hitler look chosen by fate, and that Elser had been part of it. For nearly 20 years, the man who had risked everything to kill Hitler was remembered, when he was remembered at all, as a fraud or a fool. It is one of the great injustices of the era. The earliest and loneliest resistor was the one history was slowest to forgive. The truth came back slowly. In 1959, a journalist published a careful investigation showing that Elser had acted alone, out of genuine conviction. A few years later, his original interrogation files resurfaced, page after page in which Elser, under torture, had insisted on the same simple story. The documents confirmed it beyond doubt. There had been no British plot, no communist network, no hidden hand, just one Carpenter and a conscience he could not silence. And here is why his story matters. We tend to imagine resistance to Hitler as the work of generals and aristocrats, the famous bomb plot of July 1944, with its colonels and its briefcase. But those men acted late, when Germany was already losing, and they failed. Georg Elser acted in 1939, before the war had even spread across Europe, when Hitler stood at the height of his popularity, and almost no one dared oppose him. He had no rank, no allies, no power, only his own 2 hands and his own judgment. And he came closer to killing Hitler than the entire German military establishment ever would. He is the proof that you did not need to be a general to see the truth. You only needed the courage to act on it. Today, Georg Elser has finally taken his place in the story of his country. There are streets and schools that carry his name. There is a memorial center in the town where he grew up. And in the heart of Berlin, on Wilhelmstrasse, a towering steel outline of his profile rises against the sky, and every night it lights up in the darkness. It is a fitting image for a man who saw clearly when almost everyone around him chose not to. One ordinary craftsman who looked at the most powerful and feared regime on earth and decided that someone had to try. He was right. He was alone, and he was 13 minutes away from changing the world.